today we are going to talk about the mature Harappan phase of the Harappan civilization, spanning a chronological period of 2600 to 1900 BC. Now, before we talk about this phase, which actually saw the efflorescence of the civilization, we need to look back. I would like to take you back to an earlier phase of 3200 to 2600 BC, a phase which archaeologists have called the pre or early Harappan. By this they mean these various rural settlements dotting the geographical expanse of land in modern Pakistan, Afghanistan and Balochistan, rural settlements where Mehergarh is one of the most important sites which was explored and excavated for various seasons. You must be all aware of the site of Mehergarh. Now, archaeologists trying to understand the mature Harappan phase look for the origins or roots of the mature Harappan in these earlier rural settlements, which are called the pre and the early Harappan cultures. They see the germs in the house building methods, in the use of terracotta, in the various subsistence patterns.
The remains of the Indus or the Harappan civilization can be found in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. These sites range from urban centers to rural settlements, craft centers, campsites and a few probable ports. Though spread over such vast area, there is cohesiveness in some aspects of the Harappan civilization. One can discern some universal characteristics or Indus features in most of these centers. This raises many questions. Was it a large kingdom with smaller townships? Was there a central authority that determined a certain way of life? In this program, we shall deal with economy, agriculture, craft, technology, and trade.
First aspect that I would like to take up is subsistence. Now, as we have already seen, there is a vast diversity of geographical regions covered by the mature Harappan phase. So, what is the nature of subsistence patterns, or what are the different subsistence patterns that we are finding in this vast geographical expanse of land? Now, there are two sciences on which archaeologists depend, the sciences of paleobotany and archaeozoology, looking at floral and faunal analysis respectively, helping archaeologists to understand the past adaptation patterns. Now, the significant major river of the greater Indus region is of course the Indus, that is the drainage system. To the west of the Indus, you have this huge tract of land across West Asia where there is a practice of growing agricultural crops, the rabi crops like wheat and barley, and you also come across certain animal species which were raised, which were domesticated, like cattle, goat, sheep, etc. So, it is quite natural to find Harappans relying on some of these agricultural rabi crops like wheat, barley. Apart from that, lentil, mustard, peas, linseed, gram, etc. Now, the Harappan region also lies on the western margins of the southwestern monsoon zone of West Asia, and therefore you also come across some summer crops like the sesame, cotton, as well as the summer growing rice and millets. Then bear and date seeds have been identified, as well as beans which grew throughout the year. So, you find quite a diverse agricultural pattern in this region. Fiber and oil were extracted from cotton and sesame. Now, what about the irrigation facilities? Do we have any idea of that?
This river Sindh, with its numerous tributaries, was the main drainage system for many of the Indus settlements. It provided water and fertile soil. It may even have been used as a transportation system. Beside the rivers, evidence of canals and wells point to some irrigation system, however rudimentary. ploughed fields in Kalibangan, and a terracotta model of a plough point to advancement in agriculture.
Scholars have debated on whether the climate during the mature Harappan phase, whether it was different from what it is now. Now, some scholars have said that the climate between 5510 to 2230 BC was better than what it is today. However, there is no proof of that whatsoever. Now, after agriculture, we turn to another mainstay of economy, that is the economy of subsistence, and that is the pastoral. How do archaeologists talk about past pastoralism? They try to talk about past pastoralism from an analysis of faunal remains as well as studies of comparative material of species both wild and domesticated in these regions, and iconographic representation of animals. According to such studies, cattle, sheep, goat, dog form the bulk of species found in the archaeological sites here. Apart from these, camel was possibly domesticated. Water buffalo has been depicted on some of the seals, but not many bones have been found from the sites. And so we find that these are the major species which were exploited, which formed the mainstay of pastoralism. Apart from this, some aquatic species like fish and mollusks were possibly exploited on the coast of eastern Balochistan. Hunting also formed a very important part of the subsistence practices. Now, recent studies on subsistence have tried to relate some aspects of subsistence with some aspects of urbanism, like provisioning, which is the distribution of food material across sites. Scholars who have been working on this look at the distribution of food processed and procured throughout these various sites, and therefore we see that understanding past subsistence patterns does not only mean a reconstruction of past diet. Now, we usually see that craft objects leave very tangible indicators in the archaeological record, and therefore, especially in a Bronze Age economy like the Harappans, we find that archaeologists have a greater scope to talk about craft and technology rather than talking about religious systems, social organization, etc. Now, the first person, in fact, he was a pioneer in archaeological thought, that is Gordon Childe. He was the first person to talk about Bronze Age beyond just the Bronze Age technology, and he tried to relate Bronze Age technology to specialization and different forms of urbanism, which carried greater socioeconomic implications. Subsequently, archaeologists working on Bronze Age economy have dwelt on these concepts and elaborated on many of these ideas of Gordon Childe. Now, understanding craft objects, understanding the implications of art craft objects is very important in an economy, especially like the Harappans, where there was no market force and where there was no currency system. Also, scholars have said that to understand the location and function of settlements as well as the interrelationship between settlements, it is important to understand the craft objects, objects and the technology. Now, I will be talking about some of the principal craft and technological systems of the Harappans, and the first important aspect that I would like to talk about is, of course, metallurgy. In metallurgy, copper and copper alloys form the most dominant part. Now, there are several indicators, tangible indicators from which we can talk about this. Firstly, the presence of ores or fragments of ores. Secondly, the presence of kilns or fragments of kilns. Thirdly, the slag that is produced from the copper smelting activity as seen at Balakot. Fourthly, from the various tools which were used like crucible fragments, molds, metal drills, anvils, hammerstones, etc. And then from the presence of semi-finished or finished objects, metal objects like smelting or melting ingots. Now, these are the various indicators that are left in the archaeological record.
Actual copper smelting has been discovered in Lothal, Mohenjo-daro, Alavino and Balakot. But copper objects have been found in many other sites that did not show any processing activity. This implies a lot of things: transportation, trade, exchange and specialization, to mention a few.
Now, we can see that there is actually no relationship between the size of a site and the nature of copper working at that site. Also, we find that these sites where the copper objects have been found are seldom located close to the raw material sources. Now, which were the raw material sources for copper? They are found in parts of Balochistan and in Rajasthan near modern Ajmer and Jaipur. Sometimes it's very difficult to talk about the scale of working from the nature of archaeological evidence. Now, there is almost no site in the entire Harappan system where you do not come across beads. These beads are made from semi-precious stones like agate, jasper, chalcedony, quartz, lapis lazuli, and they are indicators, they serve as indicators of ethnic identity, economic control, trade as well as socio-economic status. Now, what are the indicators of bead working that we find at the various sites? You find nodules, you find bead rejects, vesters, you find drills, stone drills, horns for grinding, as well as some of the unfinished bead objects. Now, what are the main sources of these raw material that we are finding? Lothal, Nagwara, Surkotoda in the Gujarat region, Mohenjo-daro, Chanhu-daro and Amri in Sindh, Mitathal and others and some other sites in Punjab. Now, here also we find that very seldom that you find that many of these sites were located close to the raw material sources. Also, there is no relationship between the size of the site and the nature of bead working. The scale of working is also sometimes difficult to talk from the nature of archaeological record. Now, very interesting ethno-archaeological studies have been done with the bead making tradition in Khambat. And here archaeologists have tried to relate between the bead making activities and the nature of archaeological deposits, and from there trying to understand the past patterns. You're all aware of the shell bangles that we still find now. Now, Harappa, it is very interesting that in the Harappan system you find sometimes the entire sequential representation of the manufacturing techniques of some of these objects. The most important, or perhaps the species that was most well exploited of these species, was the Turbinella pyrum. Now, you find these, which is actually the conch shell. Now, Turbinella pyrum was used for making shell bangles. Apart from these Turbinella pyrum species, you also come across other species which were used in making shell bangles, inlays, figurines and various kinds of archaeological objects. Here also we find that it's very difficult to talk about the scale of working. There is as such no relationship between the size of the site and the nature of working. At Nageshwar, one has tried to locate these various shell working areas. Now, Kenoyer, looking at the distribution of the shell products as well as the distribution from the raw material source regions, has tried to work out a complex system of hierarchy of interaction spheres and the exchange systems of the Harappans. Now, another important thing is where this shell was coming from. Shell product, the raw material was coming from the Karachi and the Makran coast, from Oman as well as from the Gulf of Kutch and Gulf of Khambat.
Steatite is popularly known as soapstone. It is commonly used for very intricate carvings. It is a metamorphic rock rich in talc and magnesium. The Harappan civilization used steatite to make weights, inscribed seals and tablets. But the most important work that has come down to us is this so-called priest king.
Now, the next technology that I would like to talk about is the ceramic technology, which has been divided into 4 basic categories: terracotta, the stoneware technology, faience and refractory ceramics. Now, depending on the nature of products, these are further divided into some categories and subcategories. The various products would range from pottery, figurines, ornaments, tools, architectural components, etc. Now, if you look at the pottery of Harappan system, then you see that there is a wide diversity, various regional styles tied with some coherent essential Harappan feature. These have been subjected to very detailed and incisive analysis by archaeologists. Similarly, stoneware bangle production has also been studied, and you come across these rare exquisite pieces of bangles. Refractory ceramics is something that is, this technology is very useful for steatite technology, for pottery making, for faience production and metallurgy. And these understanding refractory ceramics has wider socio-economic implications for the Harappan system.
Faience is a conventional name in English for fine tin glazed pottery on a delicate pale buff body. Faience has attained the status of a precious stone. Though it involves a rather high level of technology, the Harappan civilization seemed to have mastered it.
Now, there are a lot of fine spots, but very few of these places where faience was made, mainly at Lothal, Chanhudaro and Mohenjo-daro. Obviously, that signifies that is that the implication is that it was a complex technology and could only be made at a few places. Now, the last aspect of the craft traditions that I would like to dwell on is lithics. Although we are having so many metal products, you're having terracotta and so on and so forth, but Harappans did not lose sight of lithics. They did not, lithics still formed an important component of the Harappan craft technology.
Chert is a fine-grained silica-rich sedimentary rock. It comes in various colors, but grey, brown and rusty brown are very common. It was used by ancient civilization for making tools.
So, you come across stone chert tools, chipped and ground tools to be used in subsistence activities and activities of craft and technology when such tools did not suffice. So, these would range from unmodified flakes, blades, cutting tools, then various components of sickles, drills, etc. Now, what are the various implications that we are finding from the recent studies? Recently, chert manufacturing debris has been found from an area called the Rohri, and that is giving us some insight into the chert manufacturing process. Then the recent studies of Khambat bead making also show some of the tools, lithic tools, which were used in this manufacturing. Then recent excavations of Harappan carried out in 1994 have revealed certain areas in Harappa from where these chert manufacturing debris and some finished goods were collected. So, these have great implications to understand the lithic industries. This is almost a summary. In very brief, we have talked about the different aspects of craft and technology. Now, certain key points that I would like to highlight at the end of this section. Firstly, we find that most of these sites where you're finding these remains, they are located away, most of them are located away from the raw material sources. So, this has basically as a logical corollary, this has two implications. First, what is that there was a distribution system between these raw material sources and places where they were taken and manufactured, as well as the relationship of Harappans with populations living outside the region. Some of these raw material sources fell into that region. Secondly, we find that generally one single site is sometimes mentioned associated with a craft tradition. But many times we come across, in fact there are a few occasions where we come across sites which where you have remains of multiple crafts and traditions like Lothal, Janhudaro and Mohenjo-daro. Now, I've already talked about the distribution system and the internal exchange system, which may have been important, which we can find from an analysis of craft traditions. Now, another important thing is when we look at certain crafts like the steatite seals, the weights, these were produced only in a few sites and possibly there was a controlling authority over these. Then what about the luxury items of the etched, which are the etched carnelian beads and the long barrel cylinder beads, which signify some kind of a status. These are also seen, they may be found in various sites, but these can be associated with such significance of identity of status, which is very important in a Bronze Age economy. Now, another thing that we are seeing is that many of these crafts and traditions require require specialist craftsmen. Now, these would obviously bring forth the issue of specialization in the urban context of a Bronze Age economy. Now, I already mentioned about the steatite seals and the tablets, that inscribed tablets that we are finding, and how a controlling authority may have been over this. These are found only in certain urban contexts, not in the rural settlements. So, the relationship between specialized crafts and urbanism, a very important feature of Bronze Age economy, is highlighted here. So, this is how we can have a brief idea about the craft and technological traditions of the Harappan system. Now, when we take up trade and exchange, the first thing that we would like to dwell on is how do we define trade? Do we call all exchange as trade, all transactions as trade? Here, Dr. Shireen Ratnagar has a very important point to make, which she makes in many of her works, particularly in Understanding Harappa, which I feel all of you should read because that is a very basic book to understand this great civilization. Now, there she is saying that when there are these transactions between two parties, transactions mean that when one party is willing to sell certain things, certain objects to another party in exchange of others, and there is an inbuilt commercial advantage in this, that would be exchange. It might not always be trade when there is no market system, when there is no currency, as we see in the case of the Harappan civilization. She also talks about this very interesting, she gives some very interesting evidence that sometimes these specially made objects find their way from one Bronze Age economy to another, and those were possibly meant for the elite class or rulers of that economy, and the sending of such goods or the movement of such goods would be just a recognition of peace or status. So, archaeologists should be very careful when they are using the term trade, especially in the case of Bronze Age economy. Ratnagar says that definitely there were these exchange mechanisms, and trade, quote unquote, can be used in some of the cases, but there was No, there were no market forces.
The Harappan civilization did not live in isolation. There seems to have been brisk transportation and communication, both internal and external. There was contact with civilizations both in Central Asia and West Asia.
Now to the west of the Harappan region, you have this huge zone that we are continuously talking about, falling in modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and all these regions had very definite interactions with one another. And this is being brought out most clearly in the excavation of Mehergarh. Now, the relations between Shahari Shokhta and Mundigak of the Kandahar and the Siestan regions with Mehergarh have been talked about in the pre-Harappan period, but we do not see such contacts in the Harappan period. Now, Harappan links with the Central Asian Turkmenia have also been mentioned. In Harappan sites, a Central Asian type bronze pin and seals have been found, and Harappan objects like silver amulet, 2 seals, ivory rods or batons and etched carnelian beads have been found from Turkmenian side of Altin Deep. Now, one of the seals has been found in a sepulchre associated with the funerary rites of the elites of that culture. So, Ratnagar is questioning the commodity value of these items. Now, Dilmun was the gateway to Iraq or Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, as we know, was the richest Bronze Age economy, and contacts between Mesopotamia and Indus are the most well documented. Now, etched carnelian beads and shell objects of the Harappan system have been found in many of these burials. Mesopotamian clay tablets refer to the goods coming from Harappa, basically of lapis lazuli, of wood, gold, etc. We also come across evidence of Mesopotamian kings eagerly awaiting the arrival of the Harappan ships to bring goods to this land where there was no wood, no stone, no lapis lazuli. However, very interestingly, no Mesopotamian objects have been found in any of the Harappan sites. This is so far as we can talk about the external trade or exchange mechanisms of the Harappan system. Now, closer to home, we see that the Harappan system, there were definitely contacts with the neighboring regions. In fact, Kulli pottery has been found at many Harappan sites. However, no objects from Burzahom in Kashmir or from Kayatha have been seen in the Harappan sites. According to Shireen Ratnagar, maybe those objects just bypass the attention of the excavators. Also, she points out a possibility that the Harappans were the superior system there, and they definitely controlled the movement of goods which travelled to these lesser known cultures, to these less important cultures. So, it was possibly an exchange system where the balance was tilted more towards the Harappan Harappan system.
So, we see that though many archaeologists use the term trade to mean an exchange of goods, it does not imply the modern understanding of trade. However, we find craft objects in some places where the raw materials for it are not available. This implies many things, as a resource person has pointed out. One thing is clear from all this, that there was a complex network of transport and communication throughout the Indus centers.
trying to understand the mature Harappan phase, look for the origins or roots of the mature Harappan in these earlier rural settlements, which are called the pre and the early Harappan cultures. They see the germs in the house building methods, in the use of terracotta, in the various subsistence patterns.
The remains of the Indus or the Harappan civilization can be found in India, Pakistan and Afghanistan. These sites range from urban centers to rural settlements, craft centers, campsites.
That I would like to take up is subsistence. Now, as we have already seen, there is a vast diversity of geographical regions covered by the mature Harappan phase. So, what is the nature of subsistence patterns, or what are the different subsistence patterns that we are finding in this vast geographical expanse of land? Now, there are two sciences on which archaeologists depend: the sciences of paleobotany and archaeozoology, looking at floral and faunal analysis respectively, helping archaeologists to understand the past adaptation patterns. Now, before we talk about this phase, which actually saw the efflorescence of the civilization, we need to look back. I would like to take you back to an earlier phase of 3200 to 2600 BC, a phase which archaeologists have called the pre or early Harappan. By this they mean these various rural settlements dotting the geographical expanse of land in modern Pakistan, Afghanistan and Balochistan, rural settlements where Mehergarh is one of the most important sites which was explored and excavated for various seasons. You must be all aware of the site of Mehergarh. Now, archaeologists Today we are going to talk about the mature Harappan phase, the mature Harappan phase of the Harappan civilization, spanning a chronological period of 2600 to 1900 BC. Now,
and a few probable ports. Though spread over such vast area, there is cohesiveness in some aspects of the Harappan civilization. One can discern some universal characteristics or indus features in most of these centers. This raises many questions. Was it a large kingdom with smaller townships? Was there a central authority that determined a certain way of life? In this program, we shall deal with economy, agriculture, craft, technology, and trade.
First aspect that